Well, a couple weeks ago, we learned about the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel, and how because of their disobedience, they were exiled by Assyria. This happened around 722 to 711 BC. At a period of time, they were all taken to Nineveh, and from there they were dispersed throughout all different parts of the world. And so the northern tribes pretty much disappeared. They became the lost tribes. Some of the people from some of those tribes are going to come back later on, but not as a group, and not as a pure blood, preserved through all the generations, child of Abraham. Last week we saw Babylon defeat Jerusalem. And so on the map here we have a couple things. On the north you see Samaria being taken up to Nineveh. In the south we see Jerusalem going over to Babylon. So that's what we did last week. Babylon came, defeated Jerusalem, took the Jews as exiles back to Babylon. Only the poor were left behind to do some farming, and that included Jeremiah. And so we talked about Jeremiah. Then the Babylonians took some of the articles of the temple with them. A lot of they burned the temple down, and they crushed a lot of the big stuff. And some of the little things like cups and those kinds of things they took back with them and put it in the Babylonian temple to a false god. Now, that's foreshadowing for something we'll tell you later. As they did this, the king of Babylon was King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar wanted the best of the Israelites to serve in his palace. So today we get to Daniel. We learn about Nebuchadnezzar bringing in the best of the best, the young, brightest men into his palace in Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, a chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Young men, without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. These 4 men were strangers in a strange land. Foreigners brought into Babylon and trained there. The Apostle Peter writes in 1 Peter that God's people are strangers and aliens in the world. See, our home is not here. In 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles," referring back to what happened in Babylon, "as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us." That is exactly what Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They lived as foreigners and exiles, but they lived such good lives among those Babylonians that though the Babylonians accused them of doing wrong, they saw their good deeds and God got glorified. Can we say the same thing? See, this world is not our home. We're just passing through. So do we live such godly lives among those who don't know God, that even though they accuse us of doing wrong, "Oh, you uppity Christians, oh, you're judgmental, blah, blah, blah," can they see our good deeds and glorify God? That's our lesson for today. Daniel's hometown was Jerusalem, and he was living in Babylon. Our hometown is the New Jerusalem. And right now we're living here. We're foreigners and exiles in the world. And as foreigners and exiles, we have to be careful not to get sucked into the lifestyle of the world and to live a life that points others to God rather than away from God. So again, that's what Daniel and his 3 friends did. There are 3 stories in the book of Daniel that show us how to live out God's agenda for our lives as foreigners and exiles. And so we're going to read those 3 stories. A little bit of another story that shows God's sovereignty, but it is one of the 3 stories that shows about living as foreigners and exiles. But we're going to read a lot out of Daniel. So if you have your Bibles, you might follow along. Of course, it'll be on the screen, but come on, you have Bibles, right? So dig them out. We're in Daniel chapter 1. Again, King Nebuchadnezzar brought them in, trained them for 3 years to be men. And it says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "Well, I'm afraid of my lord assigned your food and drink? Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. And then Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days, and at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, and Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Well, soon after that, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he was troubled by it. And so he tested his magicians and enchanters and sorcerers and astrologers. He called them and challenged them to interpret the dream, but first they were going to tell him what the dream was. Well, of course, they couldn't do that. But Daniel had this understanding of dreams and visions, so he offered to interpret it for the king. He told Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was, and he told him what the dream meant. But in all of this, he gave God the glory for the interpretation, saying, it's not by my ability, it's not because I'm a wise guy, it's because I know God, and God has given me an answer. God has given me the ability to interpret dreams. So Nebuchadnezzar praised God as well, and he promoted Daniel to a high position. And then Daniel requested that the king appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, and he did. Well, that didn't sit well with all the other people who were Babylonian and wanted to be in charge. So the first story of their living as foreigners, aliens, we're not going to eat the royal food. We're not going to eat the diet that you Babylonians eat. We just want to eat vegetables. We're not going to be the same as everybody else. And test us and see if that's good. And it turned out they were healthier than the rest of the people. Because they stood and said, no, we're not going to defile ourselves with food that's unclean that God told us not to eat. Second story. Chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And he summoned the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the advisors and the treasurers and judges and magistrates and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people everywhere of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that the king, Nebuchadnezzar, has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations of people of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Well, this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews, meaning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set in over the affairs of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods, nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Well, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall fall down and worship the image I made, then very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. And Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie them up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes and trousers and turbans and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them, and they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's commands, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces, their houses will be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. These 3 men were faithful to God because they recognized that they lived as foreigners in a foreign land. They were strangers. They were aliens. They were exiles. And when the king said, you have to worship my idol, my God, they said, no. Our God said to worship him and him alone. And we're going to make a God rather than you, the king. Because that's how foreigners and aliens work. When you go into another country and you're visiting and they ask you to worship their gods, you say, no, I'm not from here. I worship Yahweh, Jehovah, God, Creator. So they wouldn't eat bad food. They wouldn't worship down to the bad idol. Well, later, Nebuchadnezzar's son becomes king, King Belshazzar. And he had a banquet and dishonored God by using the cups. Remember the cups they brought from the temple in Jerusalem? He brought those cups out for the party. And he began to drink out of those cups, not praising Yahweh, but praising the gods of silver and gold and stone and iron and wood. And suddenly, in Daniel chapter 5, we read, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak, and his knees were knocking. What else would you do if a hand appears out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall? Well, nobody could figure out what it said, so finally he brings in Daniel. And Daniel interprets it for him and says, this is the inscription that was written. Many, many, Tekel person. Here's what these words mean. Many. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Well, then Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck. He was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. kingdom, and that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom of AD 62. So Assyria was in charge and come down and taken Israel into exile. They were also ruling over the Babylonians, but the Babylonians got strong enough, they overthrew the Assyrians, and then they took over. They came into Jerusalem and exiled Judah in the south. After a few decades of that, the Medes and the Persians came in and conquered the Babylonians. So now the Medes and the Persians were in charge of the Jews from Judah who are now living in Babylon. Did you follow all that? Okay. Well, that story shows that God sees what's going on even when he doesn't step in and fix it. We think that because God isn't doing anything now, it's okay for us to do whatever we want. But there is going to come a day of reckoning. A day when it's too late. It might be the second coming of Christ. It might be the day you die. But at some point in time, you no longer have the opportunity to turn from what you're doing. Well, Darius the Mede was now in charge of the kingdom. In Daniel chapter 6, we have the other famous story about Daniel. It pleased Darius, the new king, to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. And one of those administrators was Daniel. The other 2 satraps were the satraps were made accountable to the administrators so that the king might not suffer loss. And Daniel distinguished himself among the 3 administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, so much so that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And at this, the other administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. Now imagine if that could be said of us. I mean, do we so distinguish ourselves at work that our boss gives us more responsibility because they say this guy or this girl can handle more than everybody else? Look how hard they work. I can trust them. They're always honest about everything. They're not conniving behind my back. They tried to find any charge against Daniel's conduct of government affairs. Now, if you thought about our government and the people that run our government, are there people in there that you would trust that you don't think you can find any accusation against or at work? Are there any coworkers you say, man, they're just good? Man, they don't do anything wrong. Everything they do is pleasing and beneficial to everybody else. Daniel's that kind of guy, and I think that you and I should be that kind of people. You know, Paul told us to do your work as if you're working for God and not for your boss. To give God an honor in working hard. Now, if your boss lets you do something that goes contrary to God, then vote God, not your boss. But work hard, be honest in what you do the job you're being paid to do. When others are jealous and look for an accusation against us, do we have enough integrity? They have nothing to charge us with. There's no corruption in us. We can become that kind of people. Let's continue the story. So these men could find no accusation against Daniel. And finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for a charge against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed, except Daniel, of course, that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows were open towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. What do you do when the law of the land tells you you can't worship God the way you worship God? What do you do when the law says you've got to stop worshiping that God? In our country, we're like, well, we got the freedom to worship whatever God we want. But in a lot of countries, you don't. And in a lot of countries, Christians are putting their lives on the line in order to worship God. And if that day comes here, what are you guys going to do? I mean, do we look for excuses not to worship God anyway? And so if they say you can't do it, we're saying, well, that's the law. I can't worship God anymore. Because I know we find every excuse in the book not to be here. Right? I had a headache today, snowing, culture plan, whatever excuse we come up with, and yet, when his law said you can't worship anymore, Daniel went to his room and prayed just like he'd always done it. He said, no law of the land is going to take me away from God. Can we say the same thing? Well, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And they said to the king, well, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He realized he'd been duped. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And then the men went as a group to the king Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought in, and he could not sleep. And at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Now, isn't it interesting that he even thought that was possible? That God had that ability? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And then the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered and crushed all their bones. And then King Darius wrote to all the nations and people of every language on earth. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel in the power of the lions. When we live as foreigners and exiles, and people notice the difference, and they notice that God is at work, they give him glory. So these 3 stories show us how to live out God's agenda for our lives. Daniel and his friends lived as foreigners and exiles because, well, in their case, that's what they were. They were Jews exiled to Babylon. And they didn't settle down in Babylon and take it easy. They didn't say, well, this is what our lot in life is, let's just make ourselves at home here. They lived like children of God, not servants of Babylon. You and I can live as strangers in this strange land too, with the presence and the power of Jesus. in the world, but not of the world. The best example I can come up with was this. Last summer, a group of us went to the Dominican Republic for a couple of weeks. And while we were there, we slept in beds that we had put mosquito netting around because you don't want to get bit by a mosquito at night. I probably wouldn't tolerate that here, but I tolerated it there. We had to dig trenches by hand instead of calling Pat to bring it back over, like I would have done here. But we put up with it, and we got it. We had to take cold showers. Didn't always feel that bad if it got hot enough, but it wasn't what I preferred. When I have a cold shower here, I call the guy to come fix our heater. We had no air conditioning in our rooms. We had to drink bottled water because if you just drank water out of the tap, water was going to make you sick because our bodies weren't acclimated to it. We had trouble communicating because we didn't speak the language. The neighborhood where we stayed at, all of the houses and everything were walled in and had barbed wire across the top of them so people couldn't get in because there was a lot of crime there, because there was a lot of poverty there, and people needed to get what they needed to get, and so they were willing to steal. I wouldn't live in that neighborhood, but I tolerated it for a couple of weeks. We willingly gave our time and resources because we were there to serve, not to be served. See, it was all okay because we knew that we weren't going to be there very long. That wasn't home. We were foreigners. We were just visiting. Right here today, we all experience things like that. We don't always sleep well. We have worries about work and worries about the kids and worries about mom and dad and worries about whatever. Or we get sick. Or we have to work. And we work hard and we don't always get the credit that we think we deserve. We don't earn as much as we think we're worth. Sometimes we're uncomfortable. We have to sit in a pew for half an hour and listen to Todd. We put up with people who use a different language than we do, that might offend our ears a little bit. We live alongside people who have different values than we do. The reason is because we're strangers in a strange land. We're foreigners. We're not meant to live on earth. We're waiting for the day when our Father calls us home. So I encourage you, don't let this world get you down or wear you out. And don't get real comfortable. Don't go down roots and think, this is where I want to spend eternity. Because this isn't our home. We're just here to serve, to use our time and resources to do God's work. And then one day we'll get to go home. Hebrews 13 says this way. For here, we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. So through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess His name. And do not forget to do good. Share with others. For with such sacrifices, God is pleased. That's how foreigners and exiles live. Doing good, sharing with others, sacrificing in God's behalf. Because this isn't home. Father, would you help us? Would you help us put things in perspective and think about things in the way that you intend? To recognize that everything this world has to offer us, most of us are going to burn up in the end. And all the houses and cars and vacations and toys that we work so hard for, they're not going to last. And the job title that we work so hard to get, we won't keep. us to recognize that whatever we're going through in this world, if it's good or bad, it's temporary. That whatever goes on in this world, it's not home. So help us not to get attached to the things of this world. And help us not to get beat up by this world. Help us, Father, instead to focus our attention on Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. Allow us to look forward to the goal, to obtain the prize that you set before us, as we can spend eternity in your presence in heaven. So, Father, change our thoughts, our actions. As we look at Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their faithfulness, Father, they're familiar stories. But they remind us what it's like to live as foreigners and exiles. When you trust God and don't fear man. Would you help us be that kind of people? That we would trust you and not fear